Hey everyone, and welcome to the Joomla Show conference. I'm Steve Burge, and I'm your host for this event. I'm delighted to welcome Randy to speak with us this afternoon. I've known Randy for many years, and I think he presented the last time we did a conference like this about 5 years ago. He
I
has
did.
a good memory. Randy has a real skill of presenting technical topics in a way that even not particularly technical people like myself can understand and appreciate. Randy is a longtime member and volunteer in the Joomla community, and he's going to be talking about the magic of system plugins today. They may look like just one other kind of plugin. If you go to your Joomla admin area, there are many different types: content, authentication, user. But system plugins are perhaps the most powerful of all. And in this presentation, Randy's going to dig into exactly what makes them different and what you can do with them to power your site. Randy, welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm based in the Twin Cities area, Minneapolis, St. Paul. Most of my work, I started out with Joomla just building websites, but I found that my main niche, because I have a background in software engineering, is to build more custom solutions. So if somebody wants to get a hold of me, you go to my website, careytech.com. There's a contact button. I'll get the email. We'll take it from there. Another passion of mine is to improve upon the way we use the content management system. And I came up back in 2012 with something called the IQ project. IQ stands for Improving the CMS User Experience. And the idea is that we, as builders of the website, not only build the website, but we should configure the web management user experience for those people who are going to be managing the content and managing the website. I'm planning in 2020 to do a lot more work in IQ Project. So if you want to go to the iqproject.com, subscribe. I plan on giving out some free extensions that I'll be developing and have a blog and talking more about this particular area. I did notice that a couple of your earlier speakers in this series did talk about trying to improve upon the way we present Joomla to those people managing content. And I think it's great that people are starting to see that as a real need and looking for ways to do that. But let's go on to today's topic, which is on the system's plugins. If we go to Joomla at the very high level, there are really 8 different types of files that you can install in Joomla. And Joomla is all about extensions, how we extend the functionality and the files that we have in Joomla. And the main ones you're probably aware of. You have components, you have modules, and then there's plugins. We also can install templates and languages. We can install libraries. And there's actually a little known extension type called files, where you probably can upload sample data or CSS files or whatever. And packages is the type of extension that will basically include any combination of these. So if you have a product that needs a component, a couple of modules, a few plugins, and its own library and different languages, you put those all in what they call a package. But the 3 main that we're probably mostly thinking about are components, modules, and plugins. And today's talk is on plugins. As Steve mentioned, there are several different types of plugins. There's authentication plugins, which are plugins that do the work when people are trying to log in, whether they're successful or whether they fail. There's plugins about CAPTCHA. There's plugins about content, which has something to do with if you're saving an article or just viewing the article or editing the article, checking out the article. There's plugins about fields, which is for the custom fields. Finder type of plugins are for search, that when you save an article, it will actually index the content. So when you do try to search, these plugins will also be able to retrieve the information that you want. And you've got 2-factor and user and privacy and several other types. But the main type is system. And each of these are tied to certain parts of Joomla. But system is tied to the way we build a page, how Joomla builds a web page. So in order to talk about system plugins, we need to understand how Joomla does its work from when you give the input, in this case a URL, and to when it gives the output, in this case a web page. This could also be a request for some data, and they could output XML or JSON or other content. Joomla actually can handle things like that. But we're used to thinking of it in terms of it producing an HTML page. And as it's taking this and producing the end result, there are several steps that go on, and it's the system plugin that actually do its work during the page building process. Now, what is the value of understanding Joomla under the hood? And I like to summarize it in saying clients have challenging requests. They are asking for things that you might not be intending or expecting. And they are looking to you for the answers. And if all you know how to do is plug in an extension and make it work, that satisfies many people. But the people with the most interesting projects, the clients that actually pay the most, are those that have challenging requests that require you to understand how maybe you can customize things with your own extensions, with your own system plugins in this particular case. I had a client this past week say that they're using Easy Social for managing their intranet, and they want all their users, when they update their profile, that it automatically syncs with Salesforce. That's a reasonable request from the client's point of view. It's a challenging request from someone who puts together websites. But as we understand what goes under the hood, we can meet those challenging requests. And I think as we move forward in web development, there's going to be more demand on agencies to be able to meet those challenging requests more than just putting together a nice looking website. A lot of those people might go to the do-it-yourself tools, but when they're coming to you as the expert, it's really good to understand your CMS and how it works. So let's go on and talk about how Joomla builds a page and how system plugins fit into this whole scheme. When we have a request coming in, a URL, and we get the page coming out, in between, Joomla is doing a lot of processing. And I'm breaking this into 7 different steps. The reason I break it into steps is because between each step, there is something we call an event. We know Joomla has processed a certain amount of information at this point, and it stops and says, here's an event. And the event goes out and goes to the plugins that's related to that event. In this case, the system plugins. And it says, this event has occurred. Do you have anything to do? And if that plugin has something to do, some functionality to run, it will run its process based on knowing that in Joomla, we've got all this processing done. And then for every single gap between these steps, we have a unique event that occurs and asks the plugins, do you have something for this event? Do you have something for this event? And that's how plugins fit into the whole processing of Joomla building its own web page. So when Joomla builds its page, there's really several different parts. We've got the template. We may have the component. We have the modules. And then there's a scheme behind it talking about, well, for this menu item, we're using this particular template, which has these name positions, and modules are associated with name positions. And it gets on, and I could go into more detail about that, but that's outside of the scope of talking about system templates or system plugins. What I want to talk about, we have all these different pieces when Joomla builds its page. So let's walk through those steps to see how Joomla does build the page. First, it loads the Joomla framework and gets the user session. There's something called a JFactory, and JFactory is kind of our access point to say, what's the application? This could be a site application. It could be the admin application. It's the process that's running. Also, it has something called a document, which is a container that holds all the pieces that we're going to be building. It has a user object that relates to the user, and it knows if the user belongs to certain user groups, that sort of thing. It has a session recording information about this time that the user is logged in. It knows the different paths. It knows the path on your server of where the library is, where the root path is, where the images are. All these different paths are determined here in this first step. It might know the cookies. It knows the server variables, such as what the IP address is of where you've made your request. What is the time? It knows explicit parameters that you've passed into the URL, and it also knows your language. All these things are prerequisites for Joomla to proceed, and all these things are handled in the first step. So after we load the Joomla framework, the user gets the session, and we have the event called onAfterInitialize. again, a summary, what we've got. When this calls the plugin function saying on after initialize, this has happened. The plugin knows that we've got a container that contains the document that's going to now contain all the different parts that we're going to be building. It knows we have an application. It knows about the user object, the session object. It knows some required files and code that's been put in place. It knows some variables and languages. It knows all these sorts of things. So at this point, what would a system plugin do? Well, for one thing, since it knows the user, it can maybe say, well, for this user, I'm going to add some extra CSS that's going to be applied for this particular user. And then when the page page gets done and completed, that CSS file or CSS snippet is now added to the page. It could basically be used for invoking a utility, because maybe my URL has that question mark and says run backup or whatever. And if it says, well, you've invoked the run backup, I'm going to now invoke this utility that's going to do its work. And it maybe then aborts itself and the page doesn't continue anymore. But we can use this on after initialize event to say, here's a utility that I want to run. Page caching is actually run on this particular event. As soon as we ask for a page, and on after initialize, it looks and says, has this page been cached? Are we using page caching? And if so, it delivers a cache of the page we already have. It doesn't go ahead and do all the work of building the page. It stops right away. And it's a very minimal amount of work for Joomla. That's why page caching can be very efficient. You can actually load some priority paths for overrides. For instance, if you want to have another path where you can override your templates, you can create it here. You can create paths that override the JLayout directories. So you can add another one there. I've actually used this method for overriding or adding an extra path for views and models. So I can actually add my own MVC to any third-party component. All these things, as we're now initializing the variables and paths, can happen at that point. The second step is we determine the parameters and the component. So when we get a URL like mysite.com about, the router is going to take that and parse it into different values. Behind that actually is things like what is the option, which is really the component. And it says, well, what is the view? In this case, it'll be an article. What's the ID? All this information is actually, Joomla knows how to, with its router, knows how to extract it from any URL that we give it. And that's what the second step does. It does that particular processing. You may have seen portions of a URL like this when we don't have SEF turned on, or if you're in the back end. And this is like the option. This is the component with content, which is articles. The view will be an article, and the ID 70. And we have several of these that we can, any combination we can come up with. So we get the URL, the router determines the component, and it knows the parameters. Once it's done that, it calls an event called onAfterRoute. We've determined the routing. We know which component we have. We know what's being asked of that component. And at this point, we can do things like, let's say we want to check the users. And we say that if anybody belonging to this user group, and there are now in their parameters, they're asking to edit an article, maybe we have anybody in this user group saying, you can't edit this article if you are not making the request from a certain IP address, say from your own internal company. So they can't go home and make changes to an article. Maybe this user group can't make changes to an article after work hours, only during certain hours. You could write a plugin that uses this particular event. And at this point, we know who the user is. We know their user groups, and we know what they're asking. And we can stop them from trying to do things they want. Maybe we redirect them. Maybe we just give a warning, sorry, you can't do this. But we can take action at that particular point. I have found that when I write system plugins, the two most common ones I do is on after initialize, as I said before, and determined and this on after route. So that after we've got the parameters, the next thing we're going to do is to render the component. Now, the component is the main part of any particular request. So any request we get from Joomla, we have to find a component. We need to find one component and only one component. There is no way you can have a Joomla page run without a particular component. It's essential. It's the component that actually provides things like the metadata and the main content. When Joomla passes this on to the component, it wants to basically get a rendering of the HTML from that component or whatever the output is. And I won't go into long detail, but you've probably heard of the MVC or the Model View Controller. This is just a high-level view showing what happens when we go. The router goes to the component and says, go ahead and do your thing, render yourself. So we have something like option com content, view equals articles, ID 70. In this case, we know the component is the com content. It goes to this particular file. This is standard in Joomla. And from here, the typical way it will create a controller that says, what are they trying to do? Are they trying to view the article? Are they trying to edit the article? Are they trying to check it in? And it then creates the appropriate view and model based upon the request. And from there, it calls the view and tells the view, go ahead and do your display. And the display does things like grabbing the information from the model, which is from the database, and does all of its work, calling the layout and producing the HTML. This is the most complex part of Joomla is the component and the MVC. And this is just a quick summary of what it does. So by the time we're done and the component has rendered, remember this document object we've created? We've now taken the HTML for that component and we've stored that in the document. We know the title for that component, for this particular item, and we store it in there. We know the styles. It could be a snippet of CSS. It could be references to CSS files. Same with JavaScript. It may be references to JavaScript files, or it could be some JavaScript segments that is tied to this particular component. And we also know the metadata, maybe a description if it's stored upon the component. And all that information now is stored in the document. So now that we've rendered the component, we've got the component's output in HTML, or if it happens to kick it out in RSS or XML or some other format. We know the title, the metadata, the files, and the code that we want to include associated with it. And we have the event on after dispatch. So this might be a time when we want to say we want to replace some text with other text. For instance, I worked with a company that worked with one of the major manufacturers, and they wanted that little registered trademark after it. So we want to take all of the product, General Mills or whatever it is, and you want to have a little registered trademark. It would take it, find all instances in the component, and then add that little registered trademark in there. We have the HTML. We can do all the manipulation that we want on it. We might even want to change some metadata as well. And this could be user specific. Keep in mind that all these steps are conditional. If we know a user belongs to a user group, we can have the plugin take special action based upon that user group as to whether or not we're going to edit the HTML or whether or not we're going to change or add some files. The fourth step is it determines the template and the module positions. A template really is a wireframe with some very basic HTML, CSS included in it. And as it gets this, it parses and learns what the module positions are. This is important. So when we get to the end of this particular step, determining the template and the module positions, the document now holds the HTML shell, or the PHP portion actually, of the template. It knows the template name, it knows the style, it knows the scripts that might be specific to this particular template, and it also knows the module positions. Now the module, only those position names found in the template are stored. So you may have 50 module positions in your Joomla site, but if this template only uses 7 or 8 or 10 of those are the only ones they stored, which is going to be efficient because they're the only modules we're going to render are those that belong to those module positions. Another question is, what if the format of the request is not HTML? Most of you are probably thinking Joomla always kicks out an HTML or a web page. But as I said, it can kick out an RSS feed, and you can actually set it up to export things like XML or JSON strings for API calls. In that case, we don't even really need this particular part. But Joomla is hard-coded to assume that we are going to be doing HTML. And there are ways. What I found is I just basically bypass some of these steps in order to get the output that I want if I want to do something like an XML or a JSON. But I just wanted to add that side thing. We are talking about HTML, but to be a purist, it could be something else. So as we have the template and we know the module positions, we have an event called onBeforeRender. And this is one time, maybe we want to take, since we have the template HTML, maybe we want to go through and every time we find this particular class that's in a div class, maybe we want to append another class or change that particular class. And again, it can be conditional based upon the user. There's a lot of interesting things we can do at this particular stage. There's probably even ways we could add module positions or suppress a module position. Just remove the module position from our document one, and so those modules will no longer be rendered. It just depends on what the client wants and what the specific need is. So the next step is to render the modules. And as I mentioned, we have all the module positions. And unless we've removed some, this is the same module positions that we've had in the template. So what Joomla does is goes through each module position. And for this module position, it says, give me all the modules. And for each module, it says, render yourself, render yourself, render yourself. And when it renders itself, it produces the HTML snippet, which represents each of these. And it's already been holding the component, but it does so for each of the different modules. So when we complete this particular process, the document now holds a list of all the different HTML snippets for all the different modules. It knows the styles. Each module says, you need to include this particular CSS file, or you need to include this particular JavaScript file. And this list keeps accruing here in the document. What happens if multiple modules are trying to include the same CSS or JS file? Well, the document is smart enough in saying a module already asked for that. So instead of having the HTML formatted to be asking for it 2 or 3 times, this document object is smart enough to say when it's time to go ahead and build the page, I'm only going to be requesting one time that particular file, whether it's a CSS or a JS. So when the modules are all rendered, we've got the HTML for each module. We have a list of the files, JavaScript, CSS that's needed by the modules. And we have an event that goes and talks to the system plugins that's called onBeforeCompileHead. This is just before we're going to put the page together. This is the chance that we can remove conflicting jQuery files or any other conflicting sorts of files. Maybe we want to replace, we have some code in here that says, certain type of JavaScript file, we always want to replace that with our preferred version of JavaScript file. And that all can be happening at this particular stage because now we know a list of the components told us our list of files, the modules told us its list of files. And this is the place we'd be doing something like that. We can parse all the content if we want. And before we build the page, this might be a time we want to go ahead and add some metadata, such as the graphs that's used by Facebook and some of those particular tags. This might be a great place. We have our own custom process that's going to, looking at all the data we've got and inserting those into the header. And the last part is assembling the parts into a page or the output. So the document is holding all the parts at this point. We've got the template, we have the component, we have all the module HTMLs, we know the styles, we know the scripts, we know metadata. And we take all these things and we build the page, in this case, an HTML page. And at this particular stage, we have our final event, system event, called onAfterRender. We have just rendered all the parts into the final output that we're ready to give to the requester. But this is your last chance to make an edit. You've probably seen the curly brackets, and when you can basically, curly bracket has some short code to it, which gets replaced with some other value. some fixed text, some processed text, whatever. This is a great place to add that on after render. So we go through the whole HTML document that we've just created, and we find those particular curly tags, and we replace them with the text that we need to replace them. And again, that can be conditional. We can be doing this based upon the user's user group or other things that we know about this particular request. And the last thing is, once we've finished, that was our last chance. Now we send the page to the browser. The output goes to the requester. And by that time, there's really no more processing we need to do. The system plugins have completed their task. So what I've done is I've walked through the way Joomla builds a page. It loads the framework, gets the user session, it determines the parameters and determines the component. It asks the component to render itself. It determines the template. It learns the module positions. For each module position, it's now rendering all the modules. It's assembling all the parts into a complete page. And it's now sending the page to the browser. And in between all of these, we have events that are fired that are now allowing the system plugins to do their particular part. So I mentioned before, clients have challenging requests. I'd like to give us some examples of some things I've had to do with system plugins and actually some other plugins. One of the things I found is that clients want to have a quick way for me to build a cron job. So that cron job can call one particular page or URL, and it invokes something. It might be backing up some data. It might be syncing some data. And so what I usually use is a system plugin that uses the on-after initialize. So as soon as I'm passing a parameter in there, and as soon as we could do the on-after initialize, if this parameter is being passed, like a question mark and says backup site or whatever, it will actually go ahead and invoke the backup site. Now, usually there are more interesting utilities than just backup site because I would use a Kiba for that. But those sorts of utilities are things I can do by having a system plugin. Sometimes there's not just for a cron job, but also we have special things that a client wants me to be able to do things like migrating data. And so I build some Joomla functionality that can do this, but I want to invoke it just maybe one time or somewhat from the command line, but I do it from the browser. So I basically have a parameter that I pass to the URL, and this system plugin runs, and if it sees that parameter, it knows to run that utility. It could be migrating data, it could be fixing data, it could be converting data, testing data, or even it could fire and generate a report that sends an email of the results to someone. So I build the functionality, but the system plugin is my way to have utilities, to be able to invoke utilities without a full web page actually being run. Another use I have is I have a little system plugin called Add CSS Files, and I know there's many of them out there in the market, but I've got mine set up that I can have it conditionally run. So if somebody's asking for a certain component, I can ask it to load a CSS file for this particular component, or maybe even some condition on that particular component. And I use the on-after route for that. So I see when somebody's making a request, and I see what component it is, I see what view it is, I can go ahead and respond accordingly and inject the CSS file that I want. But many of the clients do come back with some really challenging problems. And one of the problems I've seen is like they want something that we're using a third-party component. And that third-party component has hard-coded in its own core classes, its own core code, some approach that doesn't suit what the client wants. Let me give you an example. I have a client who's using Easy Social, and Easy Social records all the different notifications that go out in the past 7 days. But Easy Social is hard-coded 7 days, so it only stores it in 7 days, and I can't get around it. It has hard code that after 7 days, it will purge anything older than that, and I can't avoid that. So what we did, because the client wanted to track for like the past 6 weeks, we created another table that we can store this information in and they can view it in. But we have now a plugin that can be invoked as a utility or as a cron job. And it can be invoked that will actually take the data and transfer it out of Easy Social's database table, where it lists all these notifications, and puts them over into this custom table. And this is our way of bypassing a limitation that we have with a third-party product. I also had a client this past week say that they want to use some pop-up with some forms program they're doing, but they wanted to add some special JavaScript code just before the end of the body tag. And now templates usually quite often are set up so you can add this JavaScript code just before the body tag. But in this case, he wants it conditional. Only 2 or 3 pages on his site should have that in the body tag because it's not good for this code to be run on other ones. This is a quick, simple solution, is to write a system plugin that basically at the very end, after we've rendered everything, the very last event, we are going to go ahead and take that HTML code that we've already generated, find the closing body tag, and insert just before it the JavaScript that he wants. And that plugin then can have the logic saying, allow the user to say which menu items we want to apply this. And if the page doesn't belong to that menu item, we will not be applying this particular code. So that's another example of using system plugins. I'll just quickly talk about a couple other things that I've had. Somebody has a community site and they wanted to monitor all the login attempts because they know people sometimes get frustrated. They forget their username or their password, and maybe they've had some failed login attempts. So they have somebody who monitors this all the time. And so the system will actually, when somebody has a failed login attempt, it will actually notify them. And if they make a request that they need a password reset, they also get notified. Then they can be proactive and contact these people because they know their email address, and they can contact them and say, are you having a hard time logging in? And we will be more than happy to help you. So that's one example of something they wanted that a system plugin was able to help. Some of you may have been migrating from one product to a different product. I have a client who migrated from Document to eDocument. And one of the concerns they had after we did the migration is that some of the old URLs, whether it's people from outside of the site or people have it bookmarked, they might be going to the old one and the new component no longer has the exact same URL patterns for the old one. And so what we did is we created a custom systems plugin that basically says if anybody is coming to a URL that was based on document, we have a table that we can look up and we know exactly what page to send them to in eDocument. And that can work for any time you're moving from one component to another component to do basically the same task. You can have a system plugin that's going to read all the incoming requests and be able to say, this is the old one. Instead of giving them a page not found, we are going to automatically redirect them. It does take a little customization, but it offers a lot of value. Another interesting challenge I had recently was someone says, it's an intranet, it was a private internet, but they also said, we have some really restricted information. And in order to get access to it, we need to have people belong to this particular user group. But we don't want to force people to always have to belong to this user group. We want them to use two-factor authentication to prove that they are the user. But we want them to access the general information without having to use two-factor. So I set up a two-factor authentication system and had I created a plugin for that, which is a bypass. They can say, I don't want to do two-factor. If that's the case, they proceed normally. But if they choose to go through two-factor, we store that information in the session, and the other system plugin then will know that this person logged in with two-factor authentication and promote them to the new user group. And now they get access to the more sensitive data. So they can view the site as everybody else, but by using two-factor authentication, they get additional access to sensitive data. And I mentioned this earlier. I think one of the more interesting things I've created was a plugin that actually allows me to say, I also want to check a different directory for the model on components, also a different directory for the view. And this allows me to create my own MVC for something even like articles. I can create one that's going to basically, the view is now not going to output as HTML, but might output as JSON or XML or some other format like that. And I'm able to do that by having a system plugin that allows me to create my own view and my own model. This is getting rather deep into some customization, but Joomla is set up for being extensible and allowing us to meet a lot of the challenges that our clients have. As I said before, the clients who have the interesting projects and pay the most have challenging requests. And we can do this with Joomla. We just need to understand how to use Joomla in order to meet those challenges. Going on about plugins, a couple books to recommend. This one, Programming Joomla Plugins. Of course, as it comes out maybe 2 or 3 years ago, things can get dated with Joomla 4. I'm sure there's been some changes, but it's still a good one to get started to learn more about all the different types of plugins. Another book that's dated is called Joomla Programming, but it has a section that covers much of what I've told you about the different ways that Joomla builds a page. And yes, while there's been some changes to Joomla, it gives you a very good background. And that, again, is called Joomla Programming. Contact me, again, careytech.com. I said I was going to be giving out some free extensions in the future. I'm going to be talking more about things about how we can make the user experience better, those sorts of things. And go to iqproject.com, and there's a subscription there, and you'll be getting emails accordingly. And that's a summary of Joomla System Plugins explained. I'll stop at this point and see if there's any questions or anything more to do.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Randy.
Sure.
Let's open this up to anyone who has any questions. Okay, question from Paul. How does a plugin get tied to an event?
Joomla, when it builds the page, it also has the mechanism of saying, I'm going to call plugins. And it's smart enough in the page building process. I get all the system plugins, and I'm going to go through each plugin and say this event on after initialize, for instance. It says I'm going to tell that plugin, here's the event on after initialize, and do you have anything to do? Now, that's a common layman's term, but it basically goes to the plugin and calls a function on that plugin saying on after initialize. So the whole process of Joomla building the page, it gets the set of system plugins, and it goes through each one and says, do you have something to do? Here, go ahead and do it. And when it's done, when they're all done, then Joomla will resume and do the next step.
Okay, question from Jim. Is the code to perform the 7 steps found in the component or in the Joomla core?
It's in the Joomla core because the components are swappable. When Joomla on the second step, it basically determines what the component is, and then it invokes the component in the third step. And so whatever component, it could be an e-commerce thing, it could be articles, it could be contacts, whatever you've got. That's the component. But the whole Joomla framework, what I showed you is universal for all Joomla. And you can have code that's going to basically abort the process at a certain stage, but Joomla is naturally going to walk through these 7 steps.
Follow-up from Paul. So a plugin registers an entry point for any event it wants?
Right now, and I understand that Joomla 4 plugins have gone through a subtle change, but things should be basically work the same. Joomla 3 plugins, basically, the plugins don't register their events. They just basically, when we instantiate the plugins, the Joomla says, give me all the system plugins. The plugins themselves know how to respond to these events. So we go through all the plugins. Can you respond to this event? Can you respond to this event? And I think, I didn't do the prep in advance to answer this for sure, but I think the new way is that the plugins will register their events. So you don't have to ask each plugin. It just knows which plugins respond to that event. So that's I'm trying to be technically correct. And then again, I didn't do my research in advance on that to tell you on Joomla 4. I'm just recalling what I recalled reading.
Okay, so I've got a couple of related questions for you about documentation and learning. Would you recommend any good development documentation online besides Joomla.org?
Are we talking about for plugins now?
Yeah, or perhaps Joomla development in general.
I'm learning a lot on my own, and I'm not looking for other resources. I go online and get what I can from Joomla, especially when I want to like field types and all the, that sort of thing. I just do a quick search and I get that. I've read the books, I study a lot, and I have my own IDE, which is an integrated development environment, and I have a debugger on there. So I'm actually able to run a page and I can put breakpoints so I can stop at any lines of code and I can see what's happening line by line. I can see how everything's being added. And so I've learned a lot that way. There used to, some time ago, was a developers conference from Joomla, and I do think they should come up with a developers conference again and help people who want to know PHP. They already know PHP, let's say, but they want to know how to develop plugins and components and modules and those sorts of things, and have experts there who can answer their questions live as opposed to documentation. So all that saying is like, I think they could do a better job on probably providing that documentation. But the best thing to do is, if you're a coder, get in the code and start looking and see how it works. No one's going to No one's going to spoon feed you with something like this. And the best thing to do too is practice. You'll learn a lot. Just like I say, I run the debugger and I see what happens, and I learn a lot of things that's not written anywhere else, and it makes me all the more valuable of a developer.
Okay, I have a related question from Jim. Given the lack of good documentation resources out there, are you going to write a book for Joomla 4?
Before I got into Joomla, I was in the aquarium world, and I got paid to write a book for that, and that took a lot of time.
Wait, hold on, an aquarium book?
Yeah, it's called Tetras and Barbs. I mean, that's my other hobby, and so I was paid to do that. And actually, after I quit my W-2 job, took the time to write my book, and then I thought, what do I want to do next? And I liked working with the web and development, and I just jumped into Joomla thinking I'm going to try them all, but I stayed with Joomla because Joomla allows me to do what I want. If you notice my avatar, it's when I was in the Amazon collecting fish for an article.
I did wonder what that avatar was.
Yeah, and it's like I was out there on the Amazon trying to figure out, trying to get the story as how people who collect fish, their economic income, and what, how is this affecting the ecology and all those sorts of things. Basically going out and asking questions and learning, and then telling the story to other people. And that's what I see as kind of correlation a lot with Joomla, is I like to investigate, dig deeper, and figure things out, and then explain it in more simple terms to how Joomla works. So that's the correlation there. So anyway, you asked me, I got off on a tangent there, but now I got to remember what the question was. Oh, we're writing a book. To be candid, I think book writing days have really dwindled a lot, and there aren't a lot of people paying you to write a book, and you write a book to build your expertise. I was talking to Steve before we started, and I said, I think things live longer and have more reach by working on the web. And any work that I want to start putting more work into the IQ project, sharing some of the things I'm working with, and building a tribe and having people who are interested in the same sorts of things and communicating, that sort of thing. Maybe some web demos of this and that. But I think that's going to have a more deeper and wider reach by doing things online than by a book. By a book, it gives you credentials. But at this point in my life, I really enjoy this sort of things. I like sharing it. So I guess the long story is I don't plan on writing a book, but I do plan on being more active on the web, sharing the information and sharing extensions, that sort of thing. That's why I mentioned the IQ project.
A couple of people did suggest either a blog or YouTube channel for you.
Yes.
And someone else very helpfully suggested that the Joomla Stack Exchange is a good place to talk with other developers and learn.
That is true. I mean, somebody's asking about documentation, but I guess if you have a specific question, Joomla Stack Exchange, the Joomla forums can be good. I used to get on there and be pretty active on it. Too much client work has kept me from being as active there as I'd like, but those are good resources as well.
Well, that was really awesome, Randy. Thank you so much.
Thank you.